Hello and welcome to the very first episode of 2025 for 2x2. I'm Rohin Dharmakumar. In this week's episode, my co-host Praveen Krishnan and I sat down with Shrikant Rajagopalan, CEO of Perfios Account Aggregation. You'll remember Shrikant was a guest on our very first episode as well. Our other guest is Professor Vishal Karungulam, who teaches at the Indian School of Business on a breadth of subjects, which include software product management, digital innovation, and disruptive technologies, just to name a few. In this 10-minute trailer, you'll understand how the e-commerce game looks for Amazon now, especially given the rise of quick commerce, why Amazon did what it did, and perhaps why it didn't do what it didn't do.
But I want to spend 5 minutes from the perspective specifically of Shrikant and you, Professor, on. I just want to step back and talk about Amazon as the company, like independent of India, right? Because Shrikant also spoke about day one as a culture of execution, etc. But what makes Amazon the company special?
The starting point is you should, for any of us who's either an entrepreneur or a business leader, one of the things we absolutely must read is the Amazon leadership principles, right? And that kind of defines the way that Amazon works over a period of time, across businesses, across geographies. That is a fundamental rooting mechanism for the culture, right? And Amazon being Amazon, it left nothing to chance. It documented that in so many bullet points and stuff like that, right? So the first is the principles on which they work. The second is the mechanisms. If you knock out anything else and just remember one of them, it's like always start with the customer and work backwards.
Got it.
No matter how difficult it is, no matter how shall I say, vague or undefined the customer problem is at the moment, keep at it. Keep at it until you get it, and then work backwards from what it needs to fulfill that.
Okay.
Usually, when you have such a very strong principle like that, it's very unlikely that you'll go horribly wrong. You might make a few detours and a few, blind alleys here and there. Very unlikely you'll go horribly wrong when you start with the customer and work backwards. The second is something about what they call long-term thinking for the long term, right? Most organizations, MNCs, which come to India, look at it as more of an experiment. They're kind of disappointed by the willingness or ability of Indian customers to pay, right? And they're then satisfied with India as a talent base.
Yes.
Right? That's typically what you find from most MNCs who are operating out of India, not Amazon, right? I was there between 2013 and 16. So this is our first annual review where Amit and his leadership team...
This is Amit Agarwal, who's the head of Amazon India at that time.
That's correct.
Yeah.
Showed up at and did a review with Jeff Bezos, and he takes a look at that typical 6-pager, and he goes through that, and he starts a meeting and says that, guys, I didn't send a bunch of computer scientists to run India, right? I don't want computer scientists there. I want cowboys, right? So that changed the game completely, right? Because typically Amazon has always been manic about data, justifications, stuff like that. But I think they got it, that India was a completely undiscovered and virgin territory. You can't apply the same principles that worked in a different market and hope to succeed in India, right? So they're willing to go that far in saying that it doesn't matter if what you guys do is completely unique to India and can't be reused anywhere else, that's fine, but win in India, right? I think that culture stays. So 3 things. If you pare away everything else, focusing on the customer, thinking in decades, and being willing and able to do exactly what is required for that market to succeed, no matter if it's not been done anywhere else. I think these are positive indicators from a cultural perspective, which I think is why I said that we've still just not seen anywhere close to peak Amazon. Yes, there are. I agree with you that it's getting a little cluttered to find what I want.
Maybe there'll be micro peaks and micro troughs within their segments.
There will be those experiments where they probably, index too far one way or the other. But that tells you a deeper story. They're willing to experiment.
Professor, I think I'll throw it to you. I think I just have like 2-part question. Question part 1 is that what do you think, because you teach disruption, you teach companies, you teach strategy. Like in your mind, what is Amazon's specific distinctions and what makes it so difficult? What makes it so interesting, different, that you think is something that gives it some kind of a power. And I think the second point that I have is, I'm just taking off what Shrikant said. If it's very nice to say, I guess I agree with him that in terms of, oh, you have to think in terms of the customer, you have to be obsessed with it, and you have to think in terms of decades. But I imagine one of the problems with something like that is when you think, or when you're constantly in the long term thinking, you can justify losses in the short term very easily. Thinking that, oh, it's okay that we miss quick commerce because we're thinking in terms of decades. It's okay that we're losing payments because we're thinking in decades. How do you now reconcile these two?
So we'll take US as an example. So if you think about it, in a typical retail business, if you talk about typical retail, and more so in e-commerce, right? Any retail business, you think of three different levers that you have, and you start thinking of these three things as being your main differentiating factors, right? So typically they'll talk about price as being a differentiator. Like, I can sell cheaper, I can sell higher, I can create more value, all of those kind of things. They'll talk about selection as being a differentiator, saying I have, multitude of SKUs. Like I think Amazon India said, I have 1.2 million different SKUs and I want to go to 1.5 million SKUs, whatever number you pick, right? So selection usually is spoken about as a differentiator. And then experience is spoken about as a differentiator. A lot of things that Rohan was talking about is experience. And what we do is and I'll talk about experience a little bit more deeper, but what I want to segregate in the experience is a lot of people think of experience as your discovery, buying, and payment experience. There's a lot more to experience than that. Mainly, it is your inventory management and delivery experience, which actually seemingly is more important than anything else. And we'll come to that in a second, right? So that's the experience piece. Now, if you break these three things down, and there's actually a lot of interesting research that's happened in this area. So, one is we can actually look at what companies have done. We can also look at what peer-reviewed research says. And research has actually been done in this area. And we found that if you take price as an example, like conventional wisdom will tell you that, look, price online has to be lesser than what it is offline. And it's true. Research proves the same thing, right? Specifically, there is this very nice paper where what they'd done is they'd used internet channel as the channel in which you can sell books and CDs. And they looked at, I think, 8,500 different price observations over 15 different months across 41 different companies which were selling, these sets of products. And they saw that internet prices, and I have numbers here. So the internet prices were about 9 to 16% lower than other retail, right? So offline retail, which we expect, which is great, right?
Which country was this, Professor?
This is in the United States, right? So because I'm talking about Amazon winning US.
Yeah, fair enough.
The industry. And because that's important context, because you'll see a lot of things they did well in US, they brought to India. And that also helped them a little bit, didn't help them a little bit. So it's important to kind of understand that context, right? The other thing that we see online, which is also interesting, by the way, when we talk about pricing, is it was observed that the price adjustments online were about 100 times smaller than what it was in retail, which means your adjustment number is smaller, but the number of times you're adjusting is larger. We call this dynamic pricing, right? Now we call all of this saying algorithm-driven pricing, whatever. The pricing difference you'll say will be like 5 rupees, 10 rupees, 20 rupees, or 5 cents, 10 cents. But in retail, it's different, right? Because menu costs are very high. But the third one is the interesting one. You see, you will assume that because there's so much of information transparency that's available online, the prices have to be similar, right? Across all of these online commerce companies. But what you actually observe is that the dispersion is larger.
Okay. What does that mean?
So what it means is the same item is priced differently by different online retailers. And you see that even today. The price on Amazon is slightly different from the price on Flipkart, right? So what the research kind of observed is to say that, look, things like competition, branding, awareness, trust, these seem to be important enough factors because of which there is dispersion in price.
Correct.
Which brings to the point that Rohan was talking about, where he said that he used to be Flipkart, he went to Amazon because there was some amount of experience, trust, intangibles that were available on Amazon, because of which he was okay to move from one company to the other company, right? So those are the price intangibles. So what ends up happening, if you look at it this way, this price doesn't seem to be a big competitive advantage, right? That this becomes the problem. If you look at assortment or selection is a bigger challenge, because the more the selection, better discovery you need, more difficult it is for you to find what you want. So you have to build the right kind of experience, which brings us to the third kind of, leg of the stool, if you will, which is the experience. And which is where I think Amazon shined. And where it shined is, if you think about the experience, because they're operating in a place where it's the long tail, like you were saying, they had to have a great product discovery experience. So which means they ended up investing in the tech to make sure that product discovery was meaningful. They were one of the first to come up with very good recommendation engines. They had all of these ways in which you can filter products meaningfully. You can find the right product that you want. All of these things is what they did first in the US, right? So they perfected the art of discovery and making the product available, if you will. That's the first thing. But the interesting thing that they did, and there's also another interesting research paper on this, which says that they got their supply chain right. And the supply chain they got right works very well in the US. And this is also important to understand, right? It works really well in the US because, the idea is like, if I actually make it an optimization problem and I do a network design, the math actually works in the US. Because if I say it's going to take 20 minutes, it's going to take 20 minutes, right? And what I can also do is I can optimize for these 3 Ds of supply chain expertise. And Amazon did it really well. The 3 Ds that we typically talk about are distance. Distance essentially says that if you have a longer distance, right, you can actually have larger ways of transportation, consolidation, if you will. So they have these large trucks that move about stuff in the US, if you remember. Then we talk about what is called as density. Density, basically, you can say that if everything is going to one city, I can consolidate orders slightly better. So there is amount of density. And then there is demand. Demand is always going to be variable. But if you come to this conclusion saying, I have to ship 500 miles, and because I have to ship 500 miles, time is okay, I can consolidate all my orders, put it together and ship it together, then you have a lot of advantages. And now you can use this demand to understand where do you put your warehouse, right? So they got their network design right. They got their supply chain consolidation right. And they did a really, really good job at it, right? And in US, it works really well. And they got the same thing to India, right? So tech expertise and operational expertise.
I agree with Professor that Amazon came in with technology, supply chain, etc., which was actually created and matured in the US, and it applied it to India. And even though in India they had to face things like you can't hold your own inventory and you're not technically the seller, but you're only a platform. Let's remember that in the US, Amazon grew primarily as an inventory holding first party seller, and then it launched its platform model, right? In India, very quickly it had to kind of respond to regulations and become like a pure platform, right? And it did that admirably well. Now, I mean, the reason I switched from Flipkart to Amazon was because I felt Amazon was anticipating and responding to shifting consumer behavior, whether they be intangibles like trust. If I bought something, would I be able to return it? Is their customer service good? Do I need to really keep track about every item? I mean, is it returnable, not returnable, etc.? Like, they got all of those right. So the point that I made about lead indicators is because I never felt that I was searching for something and after a lot of searching and finding, I found Amazon. No, Amazon actually anticipated, I mean, to Shrikant's point, what the consumer or the customer desires and responded to it. And I'll keep going back to that lead indicator point again, because today and for the last few years, I have stopped sensing that from Amazon. I sense that Amazon itself is kind of lost. And there's so much of noise. And this is the reason I was asking Professor about which country, because I feel like India is a fundamentally different country now. And of course, we keep saying that India is many countries in one and all those cliches. That's true. India has also regulations. India is also hyper competitive. Like, for example, the point that Professor was mentioning about prices is no longer true in India. This was just 10 minutes from our conversation. Of course, there's a lot more that we got into the discussion, including Amazon, the enterprise side of it, and how Prime and streaming might mean moats that it might want to rely on. If you'd like to listen to the full episode, you can head over right now to the Ken and become a premium subscriber to catch up on everything else that we've discussed. Your premium subscription will also get you access to all of our long-form stories, newsletters, visual stories, and all the other podcasts that we produce. Or if you want to just sample full episodes of 2x2, you can do that by becoming a premium subscriber on Apple Podcasts at a really great monthly price. Lastly, if you enjoyed listening to this episode, let us know by rating the podcast on your favorite podcast streaming platform. Thank you for listening, and we'll be back next week with another exciting episode.